Kidnapping and murder of 20-month-old Charlie Lindbergh over 80 years ago was a case that many have dubbed the crime of the century. And our next guest has written an explosive new book where he has solved the case and identified the man who orchestrated it all. In the book, Cemetery John, the undiscovered mastermind of the Lindbergh kidnapping, Robert Zorn details how forensic information and new discoveries decades later helped to finally solve the 80-year-old case. We are pleased to have Robert Zorn with us now. Welcome.
It's a joy to be with you, Sylvia. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Ken, I'm fully well aware of the Lindbergh case. Can you take people quickly through Charles Lindbergh, the kidnapping of their young son, and where we are today?
Absolutely. Actually, today is a historic day. This is the 85th anniversary of the day that Charles Lindbergh went through the streets of Manhattan, was given the greatest ticker tape parade in New York City history. He had just flown from New York to Paris and the Spirit of St. Louis in a single-engine plane and flew 33.5 hours, instantly became the most famous and admired man in the world. He was 25 years old at the time, and there has never been anybody like him in American history that had reached that level of fame so quickly and was so admired by the country. 5 years later, his infant son was kidnapped and murdered. He was kidnapped from a home that on a 425-acre estate near Hopewell, New Jersey. And it was very, very clear that multiple perpetrators were involved in this case. It took them 2.5 years to catch one man, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, but when they caught him, they completely shut down the investigation. Hauptmann went to the electric chair, closed-mouthed, and the case has been shrouded in mystery ever since. Now, going back, this actually is a story that goes back to my father, who grew up in a German neighborhood in the South Bronx. My dad, Gene Zorn, grew up to become a nationally recognized economist. And when my dad was 15, he had a stamp collection. There was a man named John Knoll that lived 3 doors down from him. John was a German immigrant who'd come to the States in 1925 at the age of 20. And one day, John invited my dad to go to Palisades Amusement Park in New Jersey for a swim. They had the world's largest saltwater swimming pool at the time. And so they took the subway, as John called it, from the Bronx to Manhattan and ferried across the Hudson. And at the top of the Palisades cliff sat this Palisades Amusement Park. And after they exited the park, following my dad's swim, John met up with his younger brother Walter and then a third German-speaking man. And John knew that my dad couldn't speak German. My grandparents were both born in the States. So he felt comfortable speaking in German in front of my father. And my dad's standing there minding his own business as John and his brother Walter, these guys were deli clerks that lived around the corner, down the street and worked around the corner, and a third German-speaking man, they were calling this guy Bruno. And so my dad picks up 2 words from this conversation. One is Bruno, that they were calling the third man, and the other is that they were talking about the town of Englewood, which was located 3.8 miles north of this Palisades Amusement Park. Now John, who has my 15-year-old father under his wing, suddenly tells my father, "Gene, you go home alone." And for my father, it was a bit of a minor childhood trauma. Here he was almost probably 5 feet tall. He was blind in one eye, and he had never been to New Jersey in his life. No one had money during the Depression to do anything. So heeding his instructions, he went back to the Bronx. Well, you fast forward, Sylvia, more than 3 decades to December of 1963. My father, by this point, is a Columbia-educated, nationally renowned economist living in Dallas. And he walks into his barber shop and happens across this magazine. And in it is an article about the Lindbergh kidnapping. And of course, my dad was 16 at the time the crime took place, and like everybody, he knew about it. But he was a kid, he was interested in the Yankees and Lou Gehrig, and who was his hero, and trying to become the first kid in his family to go to college. And so he didn't know any of the details. And so he starts reading this article, and he doesn't realize that Hauptmann had accomplices who by this point, was only 31 years after the crime, may still well have been at large. He starts reading about how the Lindberghs had lived in Englewood. And he starts reading about the existence of a kidnapper calling himself John, who met at a Bronx cemetery with the intermediary and collected a $50,000 ransom.
Oh, wow.
And as it turns out, this this John matches the physical description of my father's neighbor, John Knoll. Now, this is a 1932 police sketch of Cemetery John, the man calling himself John who collected the ransom money. And this is a photograph of my dad's neighbor, John Knoll.
Wow.
Okay. Now, anyway, what happened was, you know, my father ended up dying on Christmas Eve 2006, and we had been working on a project, perhaps telling this story. And on my father's deathbed, I said, Dad, my dad was my greatest hero, and this story is my final tribute to him. A wonderful, humble man. And anyway, I said, Dad, I will, you know, research this, and I will try my best to tell your story to the world. And anyway, so I go on a 3-year research odyssey after my father's death, and I crisscross the States and Germany in search of the truth. And as it turns out, one piece, to my amazement, I uncover one piece of compelling evidence after another that point squarely at my dad's neighbor, John Knoll, as the perpetrator of this crime. In fact, I was aided by members of John Knoll's own family, some of the most wonderful people in the world, I must add. But in fact, I had one photograph that showed very clearly features of John. Now, this Cemetery John that was noted by the intermediary Jaffe Condon noted him as a guy built just about like me. I'm like 5'7", 165, with high forehead, large ears, a pointy chin, and then a large lump or fleshy mass, an abnormality with the base of the left thumb. Well, I uncover a photograph of John Knoll that shows every last one of those details, right down to the abnormality at the base of the left thumb. And when I showed that to the world's greatest FBI profiler, John Douglas, he said, "This is amazing." John Douglas basically is the guy who founded the behavioral science unit in Quantico and ran it for 25 years. And he said, John Knoll is the greatest suspect in 80 years in this case.
So you uncover the mastermind who happened to be your father's neighbor.
Correct. A man completely unknown to history.
So what went into this book? Did you take us back? Did we figure out whatever happened to John, to Cemetery John? Or do we have to read the book?
Well, it's quite interesting. You know, John made one trip. He came to the States in 1925 at the age of 20 and died in Toms River, New Jersey in 1980. And it's interesting, he makes one trip back to Germany during his lifetime. And as you can see in this, can you see this photograph, Sylvia?
Yes.
Okay. All right, this is dated.
That's him back there,
that's
right?
John, yes, that's John staring at the camera. That's his wife, Lily, his second wife, Lily, who is kind of looking at him with what criminal profiler Ed Sulzbach calls deer in the headlights look. But you'll see that this photograph is dated December 8th, 1934. Now, John is a deli clerk who's been living in a $10 a month rented room. And all of a sudden, he has $700 in the middle of the Depression to be sailing on a luxury liner to Hamburg 3 weeks before his accomplice, Hauptmann, goes on trial on January 2nd of 1935.
Wow.
Now, the actual day of Hauptmann's conviction, February 13th, 1935, we get from Ancestry.com ship records, that's the very day that John Knoll sailed back from Europe to the States. Now, interestingly, Babe Ruth was on the boat with him, and I interviewed Babe Ruth's daughter, Julia Ruth Stevens, who was also on the ship too.
Wow, so Cemetery John, the undiscovered mastermind of the Lindbergh kidnapping, this is available where?
Well, it's available at independent bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com. It comes out actually tomorrow.
Tomorrow, so people can log on to Amazon.com and pick up a copy of the book.
Absolutely.
I'm very eager to read this.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.